The fire wasn't just flames. It was a message, a warning. 11-year-old Lincoln Ragsdale watched from a distance, his small hands clenched into fists. The heat of the burning buildings roared into the night sky, casting a hellish glow over Tulsa. His father's mortuary, everything they had built, was collapsing in on itself, reduced to embers in the chaos of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. His mother, Onlia, held him tight, whispering prayers that barely reached his ears over the gunfire and screams. His father, Hartwell, stood motionless, gripping Lincoln's shoulder, his face carved from stone. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the nightmare was over. What remained of Greenwood, once a thriving black business district, a symbol of resilience, was smoldering ruins. Their home, their mortuary, their future, it was all gone. The days that followed were filled with hushed voices, hurried goodbyes, and packing what little they had left. Ardmore, Oklahoma was their next chance, but young Lincoln knew nothing would ever be the same. One night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling of their new home, his father's words looping in his head. "They can burn our buildings, son, but they can't burn our future unless we let them." It was in that moment Lincoln made a vow. He would rebuild, he would rise, and one day the world would know his name. Ardmore, Oklahoma, was nothing like Tulsa. It was quieter, smaller, less ambitious, but for young Lincoln Ragsdale, it was a proving ground. His father rebuilt the mortuary business from scratch, while his mother continued teaching. They spoke little of Tulsa, but the lesson lingered. The world wasn't fair, and no one was coming to save them. But Lincoln didn't want to just survive, he wanted to rise. At Douglas High School, he was more than just a student. He was a dreamer, an observer. He saw the way the world worked, how people who looked like him were expected to stay in their place. Then one afternoon, his world changed. It happened when a fighter plane roared across the sky, slicing through the clouds like a blade. He had seen them in newsreels, images of war, of power, but never like this. Here, above him, he felt it in his chest, a vibration of something greater, a challenge. From that moment on, Lincoln was obsessed. Aviation wasn't just a dream, it was a way out, a way up. But there was a problem. "You, a pilot?" His teacher's laughter stung. "Son, there ain't no Negro pilots in the military. Maybe you can wash the planes, but fly 'em? No chance." Lincoln clenched his jaw. That was all he needed. Doubt was fuel. Rejection was fire. In 1944, at the height of World War II, he made his decision. He would enlist in the U.S. Army Air Corps. His father was silent when he told him. His mother cried. They knew the world outside Ardmore was cruel, that a black man in a pilot's seat was a direct challenge to everything America stood for. But Lincoln wasn't asking for permission. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he packed a small bag, kissed his mother's forehead, shook his father's hand, and stepped onto the bus. Destination: Tuskegee Army Airfield. It was time to fight for more than just a country. It was time to fight for his place in the sky. The air at Tuskegee Army Airfield was thick with sweat, sun, and unspoken battles. Lincoln Ragsdale stood among the new recruits, his uniform stiff, his heart defiant. This wasn't just any flight school. It was the proving ground for the Tuskegee Airmen, the elite black pilots the military had reluctantly allowed to train. But permission wasn't the same as acceptance. From the moment Lincoln stepped onto the red Alabama soil, he felt the weight of two wars, one overseas and one right here in the very country he was training to defend. The white officers barely hid their contempt. Some refused to shake hands. Others spat the word pilot like a joke. And then there were the local police. One night, returning from town, Lincoln and 3 fellow cadets were pulled over by 2 white deputies. "Where do you boys think you're going?" one of them sneered, hand resting on his holster. "We're Tuskegee Airmen, sir," Lincoln answered, forcing his voice to stay even. The deputy grinned. "That's so? See, I don't reckon y'all are real soldiers. Ain't never seen a Negro fly no plane. Maybe we ought to teach you your place before you start getting ideas." The next moments were a blur, hands yanking him from the car. a nightstick cracking against his ribs, boots kicking dust into his face. Lincoln didn't fight back, not here, not now. But as he lay on the ground tasting blood, he swore something in his soul caught fire. That night, under the cover of darkness, he sneaked back onto the base, bruised but unbroken. His instructor, a grizzled veteran named Captain Harlan, saw the fresh cuts the next morning but said nothing. Instead, he led Lincoln to a P-51 Mustang fighter plane sitting on the tarmac. "You want to beat them?" the captain finally asked. "Then get in the damn plane and fly like hell." And Lincoln did. For weeks, he poured himself into training. Takeoff, formation flying, aerobatics, emergency landings. He mastered them all. His first solo flight was at sunrise, the golden light spilling over the horizon as he soared over Alabama. Up here, there were no police batons, no hate-filled stares, only the sky and the sound of freedom. By November 1945, he had done the impossible. He was now Second Lieutenant Lincoln Ragsdale, a Tuskegee Airman. But war had ended before he could see combat. The battle that mattered most wasn't overseas. It was back home, and Phoenix, Arizona was calling his name. The war was over, but the fight had just begun. Lincoln Ragsdale had defied the odds, earned his wings, and returned home as a Tuskegee Airman. He had proven that a black man could fly, that he could master the skies. But the moment his boots touched American soil, reality hit him like a gunshot. In uniform, he was a hero. Out of uniform, he was just another black man. The military had taught him discipline, precision, and courage. But nothing prepared him for the Cold War waiting for him in civilian life. In 1946, he landed in Phoenix, Arizona, ready to build his future. He had a plan. He'd use his status as a war veteran to secure a business loan and start his own company. He wanted to create something that couldn't be taken from him, his own empire. He walked into the first bank, shoulders squared, heart steady. The loan officer barely looked at him. "Sorry, we don't lend to colored folks." The second bank? The same. The third? Laughter. The fourth? A polite shake of the head. Lincoln's hands trembled as he left the last bank, fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. He had risked his life for this country. But when it came time for America to believe in him, they slammed the door in his face. It wasn't just banks. Phoenix was a city of invisible walls. Black families were boxed into poor neighborhoods. Black businesses were denied resources. Black veterans were told their sacrifices meant nothing. Lincoln refused to accept it. Then, like fate itself had stepped in, an opportunity arrived. A wealthy black businessman, a man who had heard Lincoln's story, who knew his struggle, offered him a private loan. $35,000. It wasn't charity. It was trust. It was a chance. In 1948, Lincoln Ragsdale opened Ragsdale Mortuary, the first black-owned funeral home in Phoenix. But this wasn't just about business. It was a statement. The doors weren't just open for him. They were open for the community. And soon, the money started flowing. Lincoln didn't stop. He expanded. He bought properties, launched an insurance agency, ran an ambulance service. For every barrier they put in front of him, he built something stronger. But success didn't go unnoticed. And soon, the people who had tried to keep him down realized he wasn't just surviving, he was winning. And that made him dangerous. Because Lincoln Ragsdale wasn't just building businesses, he was building a revolution. Success had come, but it came at a cost. By 1950, Lincoln Ragsdale had built more than just a business. He had built a financial empire. His funeral home thrived, his real estate ventures expanded, and his ambulance service was a lifeline to the black community in Phoenix. But power in the hands of a black man was a threat. Banks still refused him. White-owned businesses refused to work with him. And now, the city itself was pushing back. It started with threats, anonymous letters, vandalism, mysterious break-ins. He had seen worse. He had survived worse. But this wasn't just about him anymore. The black community in Phoenix was still shackled by segregation. They were banned from certain neighborhoods, denied jobs at major companies, and locked out of economic opportunities. And Lincoln knew money wasn't enough. If he wanted real change, he had to fight for it. So he did what no one expected. He took his financial power and turned it into political power. In 1952, he staged a public protest that would shake the city. A black soldier had died in the Korean War. But when his family tried to bury him in Greenwood Memorial Park, they were told no. Lincoln refused to accept that. He publicly refused to bury the soldier at all, unless Greenwood Cemetery integrated. The media caught the story. National outrage grew. The city had no choice. Within days, Greenwood Memorial Park desegregated. One battle won. Then, in 1953, Lincoln and his wife Eleanor set their sights on an even bigger challenge: housing segregation. Phoenix had invisible lines. Black families were legally prevented from buying homes in white neighborhoods. Lincoln wanted Encanto, a wealthy, all-white district, but the real estate agents wouldn't even let him tour a house. So, he got creative. He found a white friend willing to buy the home for him. Days later, the paperwork was signed. The Ragsdales had a home in Encanto. When the truth came out, the backlash was swift. Hate mail, threats, cars slowing down in front of their house late at night. A brick through their window, but Lincoln never backed down. And because he had broken the barrier, other black families followed. The walls of segregation were starting to crack, and the people in power knew it. They had tried to deny him money, but he made his own. They had tried to keep him out of white spaces, but he found his way in. They had tried to break his spirit, but he was just getting started. But the fight wasn't over, because now Lincoln wasn't just a businessman, he was a movement, and the city of Phoenix wasn't ready for what came next. The battles Lincoln Ragsdale fought were no longer just his own. They belonged to an entire generation. By the mid-1950s, he had money. He had influence. But what he wanted, what he needed, was justice. The city had seen what he could do: desegregating cemeteries, breaking housing barriers, building black wealth. But he wasn't finished. Phoenix was still segregated. Black workers were locked out of major industries. Black families were still treated as second-class citizens in their own country. So Lincoln took his fight to the next level. He used his wealth to fund protests, legal battles, and civil rights movements. He co-founded the Greater Phoenix Council for Civic Unity, GPCCU, an organization that relentlessly pushed for the desegregation of schools, restaurants, and public spaces. He met with business leaders, negotiated, pushed, pressured, and when negotiations failed, he disrupted. In 1964, the battle reached its peak. The city had no civil rights protections. Businesses could still deny service to black customers. Lincoln refused to accept that. He organized boycotts. He led protests. He gathered lawyers and activists to force the city's hand. And finally, after years of fighting, Phoenix passed a public accommodations law, ending segregation in public facilities. He had won. But Lincoln wasn't just changing Phoenix. He was changing history. As the years went on, his empire grew. He created jobs, built businesses, and mentored the next generation of black entrepreneurs. He forced major companies like Motorola and General Electric to open their doors to black workers, not out of charity, but because they had no choice. The young boy who once stood in the ashes of his father's mortuary had built an empire that no one could burn down. By the time he passed in 1995, Lincoln Ragsdale was more than a businessman. He was a warrior, a revolutionary, and his name would never be forgotten. Today, the executive terminal at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport bears his name, a tribute to a man who had once been told he couldn't fly. But he didn't just fly, he soared, and he made sure others could too.